Okay, so let's unpack this. It is early 2026, and if you look at the streaming wars right now, the dust has mostly settled.
Yeah, it really has.
You have the clear winners and the losers, and then you have Apple.
Right. Apple is just kind of in its own category entirely.
Exactly. I mean, imagine for a second that you are the largest company in the history of the world. You have a market cap of $3.8 trillion. You have cash reserves that rival the GDP of a mid-sized European country. But there is one thing you don't have.
Total ownership of your absolute coolest asset.
Right. Which is a really strange position to be in.
It is. You are essentially the landlord of this massive, sprawling ecosystem, but you are still renting the very best furniture in the house.
That is the perfect way to put it, and that is the exact tension we are diving into today. We are looking at a specific deal that just went down, which is Apple acquiring full ownership of the hit show Severance.
A massive move.
Massive. But we want to be clear that this isn't just a pop culture chat. We have pulled together a bunch of financial analysis, industry reports from the early part of this year, and stock market data.
Because we really need to figure out why a tech hardware company is spending $70 million to buy a TV show they were already airing.
Right. So the mission for this deep dive is to understand the strategy. Why this specific show? Why make this move right now? And if you hold Apple stock, ticker symbol AAPL, what does this tell you about where the company is heading in 2026?
Because on the surface, $70 million is a literal rounding error for them.
It is pocket change.
Exactly. But the strategic implication is actually huge. To understand that, we have to look at the deal itself. It is a fascinating transaction because to you, as the average viewer, absolutely nothing changes.
Right, you turn on your Apple TV, you click the Severance icon, and the show plays. The interface is completely identical.
Seamless. But the back-end legality has entirely shifted. Up until this week, Apple was just licensing Severance.
From fifth season, right?
Yes. The studio called Fifth Season actually owned it. Apple was effectively just leasing the rights to stream it on their platform. The news breaking now is that Apple has written a check for a reported $70 million to transfer those rights entirely. They moved from being a renter to being the owner.
$70 million. I just want to pause on that number for a second. For you or me, that is an astronomical, life-altering amount of money.
Oh, absolutely.
But for Apple, a company that generates billions in revenue every single quarter, it feels incredibly small. So I guess my question is this actually a significant price tag in the world of media acquisition?
It is, actually.
Yeah.
You really have to remember, they aren't buying a studio here. They aren't buying an entire library of content like Amazon did when they bought MGM.
Right, that was billions.
Exactly. They are buying a single piece of intellectual property, one single title, for a fixer-upper show or a show with declining ratings. You would never pay that. You pay that price for a mansion. It signals that Fifth Season knew the exact value of what they were holding, and Apple knew they absolutely could not afford to lose it.
Because Severance isn't just content for them anymore. It has become a brand pillar.
Without a doubt. If you look at the 2025 Emmy Awards, which we have the data for right here, Severance didn't just participate, it completely swept.
27 nominations.
27 nominations, and it took home 8 awards. It is critically acclaimed, it is culturally relevant, and you could argue it is the only show on Apple TV Plus that has genuinely pierced the mainstream zeitgeist.
In the way Stranger Things did for Netflix.
Or Game of Thrones did for HBO, exactly. It is the water cooler show.
Or the refined macro data refinement show, I guess.
Right.
But here's the skepticism I'm seeing in some of the fan forums and even in a few of the industry op-eds we looked at. When a massive tech conglomerate buys out the indie creative studio, usually the soul of the project gets completely crushed by corporate efficiency.
That is the classic fear.
Is there a genuine risk here that Apple might, Apple this up?
That is the primary concern for fans. You worry about the suits coming in and demanding product placement or changing the tone to be a bit more brand-friendly. Severance is dark. It is an incredibly sharp, anti-corporate satire.
Which is wildly ironic.
It is deeply ironic that the biggest corporation in the world now fully owns the biggest satire of corporations on television.
It honestly feels like a plotline from the show itself.
It really does. However, the reports surrounding the deal are very specific about the talent involved. The dream team is staying put.
Dan Erikson is staying.
Yes, Dan Erikson, the creator and showrunner, is still at the helm, and Ben Stiller is staying on as executive producer and director.
That is absolutely crucial. Stiller's visual language, that incredibly stark, symmetrical, eerie aesthetic, that is half the show. If they lost him, they would basically lose the show.
Precisely. So Apple bought the car, but they are smart enough to let the original drivers keep their hands on the wheel. They aren't trying to reboot it. They're trying to secure it. They want to make sure no one else can ever take the keys away.
Okay, so they secured the asset. But let's zoom out a bit. You mentioned earlier in our research that this is part of a bigger shift, almost a copycat move. You called it the Netflix Playbook.
Yes.
I feel like we use Netflix as a shorthand for basically everything in streaming, but what specific page are they stealing from Netflix here?
Right. If you want to understand streaming in 2026, you really have to look at the history of Netflix. Netflix feels like it has always been the giant, but people forget they started as a middleman.
I remember that. Back in the day, you went to Netflix to watch The Office, which was actually owned by NBC.
Exactly.
You went to watch Friends, which was owned by Warner Brothers. They were the library, but they didn't own any of the books.
That is a great analogy. They were just an aggregator.
Mm.
And then the owners of those hits woke up and realized, wait a minute, why are we giving our best stuff to a competitor? Why are we letting Netflix build a multi-billion-dollar business on our backs?
Boom. That was the vulnerability right there.
That was the existential threat. The studios started pulling their content back to launch their own services. Peacock, Max, Disney+. Netflix realized very quickly that if they didn't own their own IP, they would eventually have a completely empty library.
Oh, they pivoted.
They had to.
Yeah.
They pivoted to Netflix originals, House of Cards, Stranger Things, Squid Game. They became a production studio just to survive.
And now Apple is realizing the exact same thing.
Apple is realizing that rent-to-own is a very dangerous game for your flagship products. They have been licensing Severance. Now, by buying it from fifth season, they are closing that loop entirely. They are stealing that page from the Netflix diary. Own the IP, control your destiny.
Talking about controlling destiny, let's talk about the timeline for a second, because one of the biggest complaints about Severance, and honestly about Apple TV Plus in general, is the pace of release. The gap between season 1 and season 2 was incredibly painful.
It was an absolute eternity in television years, 3 full years.
3 years. In the era of TikTok, where attention spans are measured in literal seconds, how do you sustain interest for 3 years? I can barely remember what I had for breakfast, let alone plot points from a complex mystery 3 years ago.
You barely do remember, and that is a huge problem for retention. Now, to be fair to the production team, the world did fall apart a little bit during that window. We had pandemic restrictions that lingered on sets much longer than elsewhere, and then we had the massive 2023 Hollywood strikes.
Right, the writers and actors.
That shut down production for nearly 9 months across the board.
You can't film if everyone is on the picket line. That was a universal halt.
Exactly. But even outside of global pandemics and historic strikes, negotiating between a tech giant and an external studio adds massive friction. Every creative decision is a board meeting. Every budget change is a contract amendment. It just slows everything down to a crawl.
So this ownership move is really about efficiency.
It is entirely about logistics. Tim Cook is a supply chain guy at heart. He made his name optimizing Apple's manufacturing processes. He absolutely hates inefficiency. By owning the show, Apple cuts out the middleman. They can dictate the production schedule. They can allocate resources instantly. And we are already seeing the fruit of that specific change.
How so? What are the reports saying?
The news reports on this acquisition strongly suggest that Season 3 could begin filming as early as this summer 2026.
Wow, that is a massive improvement compared to the previous gap.
It really is. They are trying to regularize their output. If you want people to keep paying that monthly subscription fee, you can't have them cancel for 30 months while they wait for the next season of their favorite show. You need a steady drip of content.
That actually brings up a really interesting point about the underlying business model here. We are comparing Apple to Netflix, but they make money in fundamentally different ways. Netflix lives or dies by its subscriber count. If people cancel Netflix, Netflix collapses as a company. Does Apple actually care if I cancel Apple TV Plus?
That is the trillion-dollar question. And the answer is yes, but definitely not for the reason you might think.
Explain that, because their balance sheet looks very, very different from a pure media company.
Let's look at the market positioning of both.
Yeah.
We like to call this the premium versus buffet battle. Netflix is the buffet. As of the end of 2025, they had 325 million subscribers globally. They offer reality dating shows, true crime documentaries, cartoons, prestige dramas, everything.
They need volume.
They need sheer volume because they need to be your default turn-on-the-TV option when you sit on the couch.
Okay, and how does Apple fit into that?
Apple is the boutique. They don't release official subscriber numbers very often, but industry estimates put them around 45 million.
45 million versus 325 million. That is not even a competition. That is a slaughter.
If you look at it purely as a streaming war, Yes, Apple is losing. Badly. In fact, industry reports suggest Apple TV Plus actually loses over $1 billion annually.
Wait, they are actively losing $1 billion a year on this. If any other CEO went to their board of directors and said, hey, I have this great idea for a product, but it's going to lose $1 billion every single year, they would be fired before lunch.
They absolutely would.
Yeah.
But this is Apple, and this is what analysts call the services narrative. Apple doesn't actually need streaming to be profitable on its own balance sheet. What they need is for the Apple ecosystem to be incredibly sticky.
Sticky meaning hard to leave.
Right. They want you to buy the iPhone, upgrade the iPad, wear the Apple Watch, and pay for Apple One, which bundles your iCloud storage, your Fitness Plus, and your TV Plus.
So Severance isn't really the product. Severance is essentially a high-end marketing campaign for the iPhone.
Precisely. It is a retention tool. It is a golden handcuff.
Mm.
If you absolutely love Severance and you love Ted Lasso and all your family photos are backed up in iCloud, it becomes very, very annoying to leave the Apple ecosystem and switch to Android. They are playing a slow burn strategy.
Slow burn really seems to be their standard operating procedure. They did it with their hardware, too.
They did. Look at the Apple Watch. When that first launched, people actively mocked it. It was slow, the battery life was terrible, people genuinely didn't know what it was for.
And now?
Now it completely dominates the smartwatch market. Look at the iPhone itself. They weren't the first smartphone by a long shot. They just iterated quietly until they were the best. They are betting that if they keep buying high-quality assets like Severance, eventually the subscriber base will grow to a sustainable level. The difference is they have the cash reserves to wait it out. Netflix doesn't have that luxury.
Speaking of growing the base, let's talk about the franchise fever aspect of this deal. Because the industry reports say Apple didn't just spend $70 million to ensure Season 3 gets filmed on time. They have big plans.
Oh, absolutely. We are looking at the potential Marvel-ification of Severance. The industry chatter right now is that they are actively looking at spin-offs. They are looking at a prequel series.
A prequel actually makes a lot of sense. The origins of Lumen Industries. That feels rich. There's a lot of deep lore there in the show about the Egan family and the founding of this czar cult-like corporation.
It practically writes itself. But the much more surprising part of the report is the serious discussion of foreign or international versions.
Like a Severance Seoul or a Severance Berlin?
Exactly that. Taking the core sci-fi concept, which is surgically separating your work memories from your personal memories, and applying it to completely different corporate cultures around the world.
That is fascinating, but it also feels incredibly risky. The Office did it brilliantly, obviously. The UK version and the US version are both masterpieces in their own different ways. But Severance is so highly specific in its tone. It is this weird, retro-futurist aesthetic. Can you really replicate that in 5 different countries?
That is the massive risk they are taking. You go from being prestige TV, which is curated, special, unique, to becoming a content factory. If there are 5 different Severance shows airing globally, does the original lose its mystique? Does it just become another sprawling franchise aimed at maximizing shareholder value rather than maintaining artistic integrity?
It definitely dilutes the brand. You risk turning a Michelin star gourmet meal into a fast food chain.
You do. But from a shareholder perspective, a franchise is inherently much more valuable than a single isolated show. A franchise universe keeps people subscribed for 12 months a year. A single show keeps them subscribed for maybe 2 months while it airs. Apple is doing the math on that retention. They are trading some of that indie cool factor for consistent year-round engagement.
Let's pivot directly to that shareholder perspective then. We promised some financial insights for the investors listening to this deep dive. We are looking at early 2026 data. Apple is currently trading right around $260.58. The market cap sits at $3.8 trillion.
Staggering numbers, truly.
But looking at the price-to-earnings ratio, the PE ratio, it is sitting at 33. For you listening who aren't day trading on the regular, can you break down what a PE of 33 actually implies for a massive company like Apple?
Sure. Very simply put, for every $1 of pure profit Apple makes, the market is currently willing to pay $33 to buy a share of the stock.
Yeah.
Now, a PE of 33 is historically high for a hardware-focused company. Usually, hardware margins dictate a lower multiple.
So what does that premium mean?
It implies that investors expect significant future growth. They are paying a premium price right now because they firmly believe the company will make much more money down the line.
But logically, can a $3.8 trillion company actually grow that much? It is the law of large numbers. It takes a monumental amount of energy to move a mountain that big.
That is exactly the primary concern on Wall Street right now. And it is why analysts are quite divided. We looked at a recent report from the Motley Fool, and they're usually pretty optimistic about big tech stocks. They released their 5 highest conviction stock recommendations for 2026.
And Apple.
Apple was not on the list.
That is interesting. The biggest, most profitable company in the world didn't make the cut for a top buy. Why did they move it off?
They acknowledge the baseline quality of the company. They acknowledge that the iPhone is back on top in global sales volume. But their analysts are looking for monster returns. If you want your investment money to double, it is physically really hard for a $3.8 trillion company to become a $7.6 trillion company in a short time frame.
That would require adding the entire value of 3 Teslas to their market cap.
Exactly. The math just gets absurd.
Whereas a smaller, more agile company has far more room to run.
Precisely. They compare it to the opportunity cost of your capital. If you look back at Netflix in 2004 or Nvidia in 2005, those stocks were absolute rocket ships. Apple right now is seen more as a safe haven. It is a defensive play in a portfolio. You buy Apple if you want to protect the money you already have and get steady incremental growth, not if you want to get rich overnight.
And the broader market context really matters here too. We have UBS predicting the S&P 500 could hit 7,500 by the end of 2026. It is a very strong bull market.
It is. But you also have contrarian voices speaking up. Bill Gates recently warned that many of these high-flying tech investments could end up being dead ends if the AI bubble bursts or if consumer discretionary spending severely slows down. So there is this constant tension. Do you stick with the fortress that is Apple, or do you take your money elsewhere and chase the explosive growth?
And looking at it from that angle, it seems Apple's strategy with Severance perfectly mirrors their overall stock strategy. It is not flashy, explosive subscriber growth. It is expensive, calculated, very long-term ecosystem building.
Walled garden. That is the term tech analysts use. Every single brick they add to that wall, whether it is a brand new iPad Pro or acquiring the total rights to Severance, makes the garden nicer to sit in and fundamentally harder to leave. They really don't mind overpaying for the brick today as long as the overall wall gets stronger for tomorrow.
So, to bring this all together for you listening, Apple bought Severance not just because they appreciate the art of the show, but to completely eliminate the risk of ever losing it. They are copying the classic Netflix model of owning IP to ensure they can churn out steady content without constant studio delays. And they are perfectly willing to lose billions of dollars on the production side because it ultimately supports their broader, highly profitable hardware ecosystem.
And they are betting heavily that spin-offs and franchise expansions will keep you paying that monthly Apple One fee, even if the Apple stock itself isn't going to double in value next year.
It is a massive play for control, total uncompromising control, which, ironically enough, is exactly what Lumen Industries wants in the show.
The real-world parallels are a little too close for comfort sometimes.
They really are. So here is the final provocative thought I want to leave you with today. We spent a lot of time talking about Apple's reputation as the premium brand, the HBO of the streaming era. High art, high budgets, high quality. But if this $70 million deal leads directly to a prequel, a spin-off, and 3 different international remakes, are they actually preserving that premium status that sets them apart? Or are they risking becoming exactly the kind of generic content factory they explicitly promised they wouldn't be?
It is the absolute classic corporate dilemma. Do you want to be an exclusive boutique or do you want to be McDonald's? Right now, Apple is trying to be a Michelin star McDonald's. We will just have to see if they can actually pull it off.
That is the $70 million gamble. Thanks for diving into the source material with us today. We will see you next time.